Okay, so for the speech and its perception chapter, we're going to transition from those areas of speech science over into dichotic listening. So dichotic listening, I think you've had an introduction to that in your clinical audiology 2 course with Dr. Downs, I suspect. Did he talk about dichotic sentence identification or dichotic digits, SSW, something along the lines? Yeah. And you guys got practice with maybe the SSW or a couple of them maybe? Okay. So what do you remember about dichotic listening as far as kind of just your experience with it?
Hard.
Okay. Yeah, so the
It's hard as a person who's listening to it to.
Hard task. I agree.
Yeah.
I don't think I've done it lately, but I'm pretty sure I'd bomb it terribly if I did it because I'm not very good with dichotic listening in everyday life. But you know what professions are typically require fairly good dichotic listening skills? I can think of probably. Well, maybe I guess. I mean, I guess any kind of busy field, maybe like waitressing or medical professions or things like that, more active, I guess you might. I always think an air traffic controller as one that would require really, really excellent dichotic listening skills, and also some kind of a communications officer in the military where they're constantly listening to multiple conversations at the same time. So I suspect we would see improvement in abilities over time with training and experience and things like that.
911 operators.
What's that?
911 operators.
Maybe, yeah. I'm not familiar enough with that, but I wouldn't doubt that if they're dealing with.
They have to stay on the phone with the person, and they still have to tell the police what's going on.
Sure.
Sometimes.
Sure. So there are a variety of fields. We don't. It's not easy for us to translate exactly the test results of dichotic listening and carry it over into how does that affect somebody in everyday life. But I think in some instances you can. When you're trying to listen to 2 conversations at the same time, for example, or just communication in noisy environments in general. So dichotic listening, when we say that, we're just referring to dichotic, indicating there's 2 different signals presented to the ears. Our testing is typically done under headphones the vast majority of the time. And so when you're presenting different signals to each ear, usually those are going to be, the vast majority of time, they're probably speech signals. The type of speech signal may vary. It may be a nonsense syllables, like a consonant-vowel pair. It may be a word. Both may be a digit as well, which would be also a monosyllabic word. It may be sentences. Those are going to be the variety of speech materials that are typically used in that testing. In different modes that you can present it in, there's two main modes. The older mode that had been reported on a lot more in the older literature, and I guess the more common mode, I suppose, in the psychology literature is free recall, where you're trying to report back everything that you've heard in both ears. Then another mode would be divided attention. I'm sorry, free recall is also called divided attention, and the other mode is going to be directed attention, where you're instructed to only focus on one ear. That instruction may be verbal instructions, or it may be some kind of cue, like an auditory or visual cue to let you know which ear to attend to prior to the presentation of the trial.
So free recall and divided attention are 2 different things?
I'm sorry, those are the same thing. I misspoke when I was talking. Free recall and divided attention are the same thing. They're just different terms used.
Okay.
So and they're both fairly common in the literature. I think divided attention versus directed attention are more commonly used in the audiology literature. Free recall, you might see in both. But usually you'll see divided attention when they're trying to contrast it to directed attention. So there's a test protocol where you may, say with dichotic digits, you may have the person perform 2 different modes, divided attention and directed attention, and you may see if there's a difference between those 2 modes in order to help interpret if it's an auditory processing or a cognitive processing issue. But dichotic listening, from its beginning, it was originally used to focus on memory, to study memory in general by, I believe there's Broadbent. And then later, shortly thereafter, in the early 60s, Dorian Kimura looked at dichotic listening to study lateralization of speech, or hemispheric lateralization. Actually, my understanding of that is going to be, so with dichotic listening, we can usually, with reasonable accuracy, we can look at which hemisphere is dominant for speech. So usually it's going to be like the left hemisphere. It could be the right hemisphere in some cases, or it could be bilateral contributions, a kind of more diffuse representation of the speech processing in the auditory system. There's a test that I'm forgetting the name of it, but there was a test that the medical team and neuropsychology team would do on patients who were going to undergo commissurotomy for intractable seizures and epilepsy, where they would give them a medication to, now I'm forgetting the name of it, sodium. I don't want to say it. I'm forgetting the name of the medication, but they would basically give them a medication to not paralyze, but kind of deactivate one of the hemispheres, the left hemisphere, for example, to see if that was the dominant hemisphere for speech before they put them under for the surgery. And I think dichotic listening has been compared against that, and they find it to be not as good, but reasonably accurate. I'll have to look up the specific name of that procedure and give you more info on it later, because I thought it was pretty interesting. But anyway, so Kimura went to study lateralization of speech in the early 60s. While she was using typically digit stimuli, so I think digit triplets or maybe digit pairs, but I think digit triplets usually. So presenting a series of numbers in each ear. If you're using digit triplets, you'd present 3 numbers in the right ear, 3 numbers in the left ear, and they would just repeat them back. You just repeat them back in any order you can. And depending on the dichotic listening paradigm, there may be additional constraints that are imposed on it. So most of the time you say, repeat back in any order. But it's certainly possible, depending on the purpose of the task, that you might say, it has to be in a certain order, or other kind of conditions, other kind of constraints that you might want to impose on it, depending on the type of investigation you're looking at. So here's an example of using digit pairs, very simple. I'm sorry, not digit pairs, just one pair of digits, single digits in each ear. A very easy task where the 8 and the 2 are presented to the ears simultaneously, 1 to each ear. The guy's thinking 2, 8, so he's probably going to repeat it back or hit a number on a keyboard, just depending on the response paradigm that's been chosen. So this would be free recall or divided attention, where the client is aware what he needs to do. He knows he needs to repeat back all the digits he's heard, so he's thinking about that and he's about to do it. The other mode would be that divided or the directed attention mode, where you're ignoring what you hear on one side and only focusing on the ear that's been cued, and you're repeating back, for example, what you're hearing on the ear that you're attending to. So in this example, the guy is ignoring what he's heard in the right ear, which was a sentence, "The horses galloped across the field," and he's focusing in on what he heard in the left ear, "President Lincoln often read by the light of the fire," and he's repeating it back. So very, very common mode we might use. So you might use something like that something like the dichotic sentence identification test, which was a modification of Jerger's synthetic sentence identification test, where you've got a contralateral competing message and you're repeating back the ipsilateral competing message. So here's an example of some common results with dichotic listening. This was a fairly recent study published in 2014, and a very, very large study, because I believe there were over 1,800 subjects, which is pretty huge for the studies in our field. Or this is more psychology, I guess, but it's still a pretty huge study for something like this. And so what we can see here is that for both males and females, that regardless of age, we see with dichotic listening that the right ear advantage is present, or essentially that we have performance in the right ear is superior to performance in the left ear in terms of syllable identification. So this particular paradigm used dichotic CVs. So my guess would be like stops, for example, ka, ga, ba, ta, da, etc. And we see that although there may be some variation in terms of the ear advantage, depending on the group, we see the right ear advantage is pretty clear across the board here. We can see that for the youngest group here, age 5 to 9, that they have the smallest right ear advantage, and then it increases with age, consistent with what we know about the development, and probably very likely related to maturation of the corpus callosum. We can see that although there are some differences between male and female, they don't seem to be strikingly different. So in the when researchers initially, I mentioned they used digits to look at dichotic listening. Then in the early 70s, some researchers were interested in using nonsense syllables, so really consonant vowel pairs or vowels alone. They wanted to look at speech in a more simple context. And so they looked at, for example, stop consonants versus vowels, and these stop consonants were going to be basically stop consonant plus vowel combination versus vowel alone. And so they were looking with dichotic listening, is the right ear advantage present, right? Is the right ear advantage for vowels alone? Is the right ear advantage present for the stop consonants with a vowel combination? So we know it's present for words, for digits, but is it present for units, the kind of the smallest unit of speech that does not have any semantic meaning, right? So that could have, because we didn't know if the right ear advantage was related to semantics or not. So Studdert, Kennedy, and Shankweiler found that this right ear advantage was much larger for stop consonants. And they said, I'm guessing it wasn't significant because what I was reading is that it wasn't present for vowels. You can see that it's present for some of these vowels to some extent, but I don't know if that was statistically significant. But either way, you can see that stop consonants have a much larger right ear advantage relative to vowels. And we can see that not all stop consonants, or vowels for that matter, have the same degree of right ear advantage. We can see, for example, can you tell any distinction between the stop consonants that have the largest right ear advantage versus the three that have the smallest right ear advantage? What's in common between B? Actually, no, I take that back. Well, the ones that have the weakest right ear advantage seem to be those that have the articulation, the alveolar stops, the D and the T there. So here's another breakdown from a similar study by Shankweiler and Studdert a few years earlier, and they found the right ear advantage here was largest when for these CV stimuli. For these CV stimuli, you pretty much stop consonant stimuli pairs. That the right ear advantage was largest when the pairs differed. So the stimuli in the right ear and the left ear differed from one another in terms of both voicing and place of articulation. So the more different they were from one another, the greater the right ear advantage. So we can look here if they're different based on place alone, 6% different. If they're different based on voicing alone, in this case it was a 12% different, and based on voicing and place of articulation, both, there was a 17% difference there. As far as what's going on here exactly, well, the reason for the right ear advantage is related to simply the anatomic and pathway and physiologic function of the auditory system and really the auditory nervous system. So we can see the right ear takes the shortest path to the left hemisphere. Similarly, the left hemisphere takes the shortest path to the right hemisphere. I'm sorry, the right ear takes the shortest path to the left hemisphere. The left ear takes the shortest path to the right hemisphere. But it's typically the left hemisphere that is dominant for language in the majority of people, in particular for right-handers. So I think it's language is located on the left in the left hemisphere for 95% of right-handers, and I think it's more like 80% of left-handers or something like that. So what's going on here? Why do we see this decussation, this crossover? Why don't we have the ipsilateral pathways transmitting here? Do we have ipsilateral pathways? Yeah, we do. You're right. Well, what typically happens with this stimulation is we typically see these ipsilateral pathways are suppressed, and they're not as strong to begin with either. So the contralateral pathways are typically dominant to begin with. So we can see if we have to go from right ear to left ear, right ear to left hemisphere, and we compare that to left ear to right hemisphere across the corpus callosum to the left hemisphere, that it's a much shorter physical distance for the right ear to reach the left hemisphere, the language center. So that's typically why we see it dominant. If we look at a different type of stimulus, instead of talking about speech, if we look at a musical chord, for example, so music, and we do the same kind of testing, we would, where they're identifying the chords, we would see a left ear advantage in that situation. So that gives way to the idea that the right hemisphere for most people is dominant for processing melody. But most of the time, we're more concerned with speech testing, and we usually wouldn't use musical chords. Cullen in the mid-70s looked at how differences between the ears in terms of various parameters, acoustic parameters, how that would impact the right ear advantage. So we know that the right ear advantage is normal. It develops over time with children, it gets larger, and for adults across a wide age range, this right ear advantage is normal. So what would happen if we modify the acoustic stimuli in one ear versus the other? How will it affect the right ear advantage? And we know that if we increase the intensity of the left ear, the right ear advantage will diminish. So we'd have to increase the intensity of the signal in the left ear 20 dB in order to abolish that right ear advantage. If we're talking about noise, if we're talking about dichotic listening in a noisy environment, we'd have to increase the SNR in that left ear 12 dB in order to abolish the right ear advantage. If we are thinking about another way you can do it would be to, instead of manipulating the left signal, we could manipulate the signal being transmitted to the right ear. We could degrade it. And so if we filter it below 3,000 hertz, or really filter away the high frequencies above 3,000 hertz, then we also see that right ear advantage will diminish. So as right ear advantage decreases, the left ear performance increases. That's something else of note here. So the implications of this are that because we see that the left ear performance increases as right ear advantage decreases, the implications here are that there may be a limited number of bits or limited number of information that can be transmitted and processed by the speech processing mechanism, regardless of which ear it's coming from, right ear versus left ear. There's a finite amount of information that the left hemisphere, really the speech center of the brain, language center of the brain, can handle. Okay. Another thing that we want to look at here would be how do dichotic CVs how are they impacted when we delay one ear versus the other? So we already talked about modifications here a moment ago, modifying the intensity, SNR, or degrading the signal. What about time delays? We know we've talked all about time delays in terms of binaural hearing, in terms of like the masking level difference, for example, in terms of horizontal localization in the sound field, in terms of lateralization. How do these time delays play a role in a different type of binaural hearing, dichotic listening paradigms? And so what we see is if we introduce a lag, or a time delay really, to one ear, and that time delay is going to be typically around 30 to 60 milliseconds. If we introduce it to one ear, the ear that receives the lag, the ear that receives the delayed signal, actually will do better. And this occurs for non-speech stimuli as well, if it is speech-like in nature. But it's unclear, it's not entirely clear if this lag effect is a more general auditory phenomenon related to general auditory processing abilities, or if it's related to a speech-specific processing. It's unclear. And you'll see that question comes up again and again and again when we bring up certain auditory phenomena. I don't know if you'd call them illusions. In some cases you might, but auditory phenomena, when you bring them up, oftentimes there's a question, is this related to general auditory processing, or is this related to some specialized speech or phonetic module in the brain? So does that special module exist? That's still an ongoing question. It's been an ongoing question for, I'm going to say, at least 50 years, I suspect. Maybe not that long, but a long time. And many researchers have looked at it. So how are dichotic CVs affected by this lag effect? For the moment, just go ahead and look at the bottom two plots, which are for the stop vowel syllables. You can see for the fricative vowel syllable combinations, this right ear advantage effect is very small. But for the stop vowel combination, we can see it's fairly large. If for a moment we look at just the left side here, and we move from a 0, no lag at all, so this is a regular dichotic listening condition, to a lag on the to a lag on the left ear, so a left ear lag of 15, 30, 60, or 90 milliseconds. Remember, if we put a lag on the left ear, we'd expect to be decreasing the right ear advantage because it's going to help left ear performance. And we can see that typically happens. We can see left ear performance increases as the lag increases up until around 90 milliseconds here. And so what happens to the right ear performance. It also increases, but very, very little, not a huge amount. It goes from about 85% up to about 88%. That's probably not a statistically significant difference, or if it is, it's a very small effect. We can see the slope is different between the two, so we can see that the right ear certainly doesn't decrease in performance, but the left ear definitely increases, and so we see that this phenomenon creates a reduction in that right ear advantage. If we look at what happens when we give the lag or the delay to the right ear, how is the right ear advantage affected? And so we can see here as we move from left to right that we see the right ear advantage is increasing. I would say the magnitude, I can't tell if the magnitude of the effect is large, but we see that there's a clear effect going from 15 milliseconds up to 60 milliseconds. We see that right ear advantage is increased. We see that the left ear is not decreasing in performance either. Simply the right ear is increasing at a faster rate compared to the left ear. And so we can see the maximum effect is usually around 60 milliseconds. It happens to be maybe 90 milliseconds in that right ear, but it also probably depends on, in the left ear lag, but it also depends on probably what study you look at. But in general, 30 to 60 milliseconds is a pretty common lag time to use. There is for all of these paradigms, whether we're talking about dichotic digits, dichotic CVs, dichotic sentences, dichotic monosyllabic words, there are clinical tests available for all of these types of setups. With delays, you can get the dichotic CVs with delays, I believe. So what do we use dichotic listening for in clinical audiology? Probably the most common thing would be to investigate auditory processing disorder. You might see it called a binaural integration deficit. You might see it called amblyaudia, which is basically means lazy ear. It's just kind of a rip-off of amblyopia for lazy eyes, what it really is. There's one researcher, Moncrief, that likes to use that term, amblyaudia. And then binaural integration deficit, you might see that used by, I'm not sure which researchers, probably Musiak and Shermack and maybe Bellis, I don't know. But other researchers in APD are going to use that term. And then I've also seen the term used, dichotic deafness. There was a psychologist that I saw use that term, dichotic deafness. So there's a lot of terms you may use for abnormally large right ear advantage or left ear disadvantage. Those are also terms you might see when you have a atypical dichotic listening performance in terms of the asymmetries between the ears. So what we do know is that there is a relationship between dichotic listening and neurophysiology. We know that, say for example, the size. There was a study conducted. They looked at persons with both normal cognitive performance and those with Alzheimer's disease, and they found there was a moderate correlation between dichotic listening performance and the size of the corpus callosum for those with Alzheimer's disease. That correlation did not hold up for the normals, just the Alzheimer's disease group. We also know integrity, that if we look at commissurotomy studies where you sever the corpus callosum, will have a substantial impact on this right ear advantage. If we look at persons with aphasia, if we look at aphasia or stroke, that can have an impact on it. Frontal lobe dysfunction, that can have an impact on it, dichotic listening. So we see that dichotic listening is much more sensitive to cortical dysfunction than it is to, I'd say, subcortical dysfunction or brainstem dysfunction. So if you were looking for a test to assess brainstem physiology, dichotic listening would not be the test to choose. The masking level difference would be a much better test. So here is just a couple figures here from some clinical studies. This was from Muziek in a review article from 2011, looking at 3 different dichotic listening tests, dichotic digits, staggered spondaic word test, and the competing sentences, all different types of dichotic listening tests. So we have this person's with epilepsy, and we have, this is the performance beforehand. We can see competing sentences yielded the largest right ear advantage. But overall, they were fairly close to normal. I'm guessing this dotted line probably represents a normal barrier, a normal threshold, so probably just a tiny bit below normal. And then after the commissurotomy, so severing of that corpus callosum, we can see that there was a dramatic decline in the left ear performance here. So the right ear advantage became abnormally large. Can you think of why? Why would that happen? Why would we have such a large left ear deficit after the corpus callosum was severed? Yeah, exactly. There's no pathway to cross over anymore. So another area that we'll kind of transition into related to speech perception, categorical perception, and I talked about this briefly last time. The idea behind categorical perception is that we perceive changes on a continuum. We don't perceive these small changes on a continuum when we're talking about speech processing. We perceive discrete categories. So a clear example would be discrimination between pa and ba. We don't hear any variant that falls in between pa and ba. When we hear something, we're going to instantly categorize it as one or the other. There's not usually a perception that someone falls somewhere halfway in between. So categorical perception, if we were to use an example here with dichotic CVs, we take a minimal pair, again, maybe like ba and pa, and we manipulate the particular variable. It would be like voice onset time, for example, along a continuum. Then we would see that it's going to fall into one category or another. Either ba, pa, not in between there. Here's a demonstration of it. Let's go ahead and pull it over there. Okay. So there's 9 items here. They're going to be either bad or bat. Some of the words may sound like neither bad or bat, in which case just go ahead and guess which you think is most like. The words have an interstimulus interval of 1.5 seconds. So go ahead and grab a piece of paper and just kind of write down what you hear so we can see if everybody has the correct perception or if there's guessing. Make sure it works here. Okay, yeah, it works. So, and I'll go ahead and put the volume up a little bit higher here. Can't wind apparently. I'll put the volume up a little higher so you can hear it. Bad. I'll go ahead and play it again because those are a little faster. Bad.
bat, 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 bat.
Need to hear it again? Or you got them all down? 9, I believe. Maybe, yeah. Let me see what it says here. Maybe I read that wrong. Oh, this is 10-1. That says 10-2. I read that wrong. Any case, what did everybody get? And for going from 1 to 6, let's see if you guys got any different answers from one another. What did you guys get for 1?
Bad.
We all got bad. What about 2?
Bad.
Everybody got bad for 2, 3?
Almost like that the first time.
Yeah,
Bad.
to me, I heard that one as well as both, depending on when I heard it. I kind of heard it more as bat, but it took me an extra second to think about that.
The first time you ran it through, I only heard the first one is bad, and
Mhm.
then the rest is bad.
Oh, okay.
But the second time I heard the first 2 is bad, and the
Sure.
last 4 is bad.
Yeah. Okay,
First
so
time I heard the first 2 is bad, and then the second time I heard just only the first one bad.
so it sounds like bad was all in the beginning, and then it transitioned to bat. So they were just manipulating the voice onset time, and so we can see that in the transition period between bad and bat, there were probably more errors. Like Kirsten, for example, when she mentioned, when she heard it the second time, she changed her answers. And we would expect that. The closer we get to that categorical boundary, the more random performance typically will be, or the poorer performance will be. So here is how that works. Here's one particular figure, way you could represent that with a graphic. We can see that number of pa responses versus ba. So again, just manipulating voice onset time. So as we increase voice onset time, we transition from ba to pa. Remember, the voiceless stops have longer voice onset times than voiced stops. And so the key thing here to look at is really the number of times you respond as one versus the other. Here, responding as ba, we don't often at all say that this is pa. We're consistently saying this is ba. Okay, so very, very low occurrence of pa, saying it's pa, feeling like it's pa. And then at this phonetic boundary, we see a very, very steep slope. So what we're seeing is, with a very small shift in voice onset time, it abruptly changes our perception from one to the other. And then we say pa all the time for any voice onset time increase there. So it's not a gradual transition like we would expect to see with non-speech stimuli oftentimes. If we look at that in a different way, this graphic is a little bit more akin to what is in the textbook. Here we can see the contrast is very similar, just a different vowel on there, but B and P. We can see that the percentage of times labeled as B versus the percentage of times labeled as P. The blue is actually almost the exact same figure. We've just superimposed the red on top of it. But the key thing that you see here that you didn't see before was where they overlap here. Where they overlap you can think of as the categorical boundary. So right around 50 milliseconds, voice onset time of 50 milliseconds to overlapping. So what do you think the implications of that are? What else is happening in terms of correct performance? So this doesn't show us, nothing on the graph directly shows us correct identification. But what do you think the identification would be right around that categorical boundary right here where they two intersect? What do you think the percent correct would be? Yeah, exactly, 50%. So that's where you're basically guessing at random between the one or the other. So categorical perception has been shown to occur primarily for consonants. Now it may occur for vowels, but to a much lesser extent. And it shouldn't occur, or at least in many earlier studies, they found that it did not occur for non-speech stimuli. And at least those were the findings in the early 60s. And some categorical perception was used as And early on, it was used as an argument or evidence to support the idea of a specialized speech module or phonetic module. And the idea that it occurred in infants prior to speaking also kind of supported that idea of some innate phonetic or speech module. However, something that kind of goes against the idea is the fact that it's been found in originally in monkeys, but the data wasn't terribly convincing. Then there was some strong data found in chinchillas, and then later on Japanese quail as well, and maybe other animals since then, I'm sure, have evidenced categorical perception.
So did they do speech and how would they do that on a?
I don't honestly, I haven't read those studies, so I don't honestly know if they were using speech or non-speech in those studies. I don't think it matters really. I'm not sure that it really matters what they were using either way, because as long as they demonstrated categorical perception, it shouldn't be present in animals that, because there is no speech in animals. There shouldn't be a mechanism that evolved for speech perception. That would be very bizarre, right? There's no reasonable belief behind the idea that animals like these would evolve speech perception for human speech perception.
Well, wouldn't they evolve like something like their own little noises and stuff?
Certainly, and so I'm guessing they did it with probably speech, but I think they weren't. The researchers weren't choosing certain sounds that they were communicating each other with. I mean, it was a strong enough. I don't know all the details about these studies, but it was convincing enough to these researchers to say that something's going on here. This does not support the idea. So that was kind of a shift in the idea that this is more generalized perception as opposed to speech specific. And actually, categorical perception has been found to occur for color perception, and I believe maybe in other areas as well, like possibly facial recognition. I wasn't certain about that when I was reading about that. So categorical perception is just that. It's categorical. It's probably a shortcut that the brain uses in order to process information rather quickly and to make decisions very quickly, and to disregard excessive information that does not help you make some kind of decision or judgment. So we can say that it seems to be that the kind of the winds have shifted, where categorical perception used to provide some of the strongest evidence for an innate speech processing mechanism. Now we're seeing that it can be better explained by more general auditory processing. So, but there are some other auditory phenomena that also may support the idea, or at least have been used to support the idea of categorical perception. These three are going to be duplex perception, sine wave speech, and the McGurk effect. So let's get to what each of those are. Duplex perception, I think this is probably one of the most interesting other than categorical perception. This occurs when you've got, say you take a consonant and vowel pair, right? Ba, pa, whatever. And then you split it into two parts, and you want to present one part to the right ear and one part to the left ear. Say you've split it up in such a way that you've only taken a formant transition. Remember, you're going to have probably at least 2 or 3 formants in here. And you're going to have formant transitions, and you're going to have the steady state vowel portion. You're going to take just one formant transition, and you're going to present it to one ear. It's going to sound like a chirp. That's what it would sound like in isolation. And then you're going to take the rest of it, which is going to be like 1 or 2 formant transitions, and then 2 or 3 portions of the steady state vowel, and you're going to present them dichotically. And then what's going to happen is 2 things are going to happen. One, a chirp will be perceived in the ear that isolated formant transition is presented to. The other thing is the brain will fuse together the formant transition in the same ear that had the chirp experience, and it'll fuse it together with the incomplete CV in the other ear. It'll fuse them together to provide the perception that they were presented in the same ear, essentially. So you'll hear the consonant-vowel combination, and you'll hear the chirp. Okay, so just as a graphical depiction of this, we can see that if we want to hear da, we would need to take this right here and move it over here. If we took this formant transition, the F2 transition, and we put it right up there, that would be da, okay? So what we've done is we've cut the piece out. We've cut out the formant F2 transition here, thrown it over into the right ear. The left ear is receiving the steady state vowel as well as the F1 formant transition. And so we play them together. They hear the da, which they would not hear if they only heard the signal presented to the left ear. They wouldn't hear da there. So they're hearing da, they're fusing it together, and they still hear the chirp. So this was taken as evidence that under this condition that both auditory and phonetic processing were occurring at the same time, that both the non-speech auditory mechanism and the phonetic speech mechanism were both active at the same time. Otherwise, you wouldn't hear the chirp alongside the CV. Right? You would either hear the speech and nothing else, or you would hear the non-speech. You would hear the chirp and some other signal in the other ear. There wouldn't be fused. But neither one of those things happened. We heard both. We got both the best of both worlds, essentially, in the sense that we fused them together to create a percept that we were experienced with, and we also heard the non-auditory signal, kind of which may be likened to some kind of environmental sound. Here's another figure that would show a different example. So this example has 3 formants instead of 2. So here, this would be a particular, I'm not sure exactly which CV this is, but here you've got 3 formants. You've got the formant transitions going from the consonant or the stop over to the vowel, and you've got 3 portions of the steady state vowel there. And here we basically cut off the F3 transition, and we presented this to the left ear, this to the right ear, and same thing. We hear both a chirp, and we also hear a CV. Here's another way to do it. So for example, our choice here would be the choice of the formant transition we put in the one ear definitely has an impact on what they're perceiving. So it's not like we can put in one of the ears that has a formant transition that we can put any old formant transition in there and produce the same perception. If we put this downward sloping formant transition in the right ear and in the bass in the other ear, we're going to hear da. And if we put this upward sloping formant transition in the one ear and the rest of it, the F1 and F2 transition and the steady state vowel in the other ear, we hear ga. So it's definitely the brain fusing them together. However, as convincing as that seems, duplex perception does not clearly prove the existence of a speech module by any stretch of the imagination. It's actually been shown to occur for door slamming as well as musical chords, and the door slamming apparently was a fairly convincing evidence in the field of speech science. So that again, this seems to be related to more general auditory phenomena, or at very least, if I say that, I guess I don't mean to pretend like this has already been decided. What I'm saying is it's not clear one way or the other. There may be evidence that supports and evidence that refutes the idea that any of these may support or disprove the presence of a speech processing or phonetic processing mechanism. Then we also have sine wave speech. Sine wave speech has also been associated with the specialized speech module. And the reason is because the stimuli can be perceived as either speech or non-speech depending on the instructions. So how we do that, duplicates there. How we do that is we take at least 3 pure tones and we put them together and we create a total complex. But these 3 pure tones are going to change in frequency the same way a formant would. So what we're doing is we're taking a series of sine waves, 3 or more, and we're trying to simulate a CV, or CV. We're trying to simulate speech with pure tones. Now, if you have a naive listener, they're often going to perceive the sine wave speech as a tonal pattern. You just give them the speech signal, and they're going to perceive it as a tonal pattern. And then if you instruct them that it is intelligible computerized speech, then they will hear the speech signal as speech, or then they'll hear the signal as speech. So for me, I needed to actually hear the original signal before I could hear the sine wave signal of speech. But I'm guessing there's going to be some variability here. So first, let's go ahead and listen to this one. Make it a little bit louder here. Could you make that out of speech at all? Okay, so let's hear what the original one was. Or actually, these were whole sentences. I'm sorry, these are whole sentences. So maybe that's why these are harder. Come on.
Sounds like aliens.
It does. It does. I'm not exactly sure why. There we go. Slow
She
internet.
cut with her knife.
Put it again.
She cut with her knife.
Now let's listen to that again. Could you kind of
Okay,
hear it
I
now?
heard it.
All right, let's do a couple more here. Start out with this one. Nothing,
The boy
right?
was outside.
The boy was outside?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what
Really?
I heard.
Let me see.
Play it again.
I can kind of hear that.
I heard
It's
the
like
boy.
the boy.
Yeah, the boy. Let's see.
Went outside maybe or something. It won't be anything like that.
They're buying some bread.
They're buying some bread.
They're buying some bread.
Blame it on the accent. All right.
Well, it's like you could put anything to it, and then your mind would be
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
fit it to it. Because the first one,
That's true.
Wait, play
I-
the other one. Play the first.
The first
sine
one, I
wave
was like,
signal.
This one again?
The brain
No, the
is
second one.
alive.
So I have a feeling what actually, I have a feeling this example I'm showing you is probably a variation because these are actual sentences. I kind of think what'll happen is if they're talking about just a CV combination, that you probably can get it without having to listen to the original first. You just have to be instructed, and they have to, the researcher has to say, okay, this is intelligible computerized speech, and then you hear it, essentially. So I think this is just a modification of the actual the other paradigm they're describing. So let's listen to this one here.
She ironed her skirt.
I got the first word
I
right.
thought I was like,
She.
something.
I was like, she boiled riced eggs.
Nah, I can hear it, right? Can you hear that? She ironed her skirt here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It says it's from a
I
nursery
heard
rhyme.
Emily.
You see that?
She boiled
Yeah.
riced eggs.
Let's see which one it is here.
Like, what's riced eggs?
Find out what that is in a minute here. I'll do one more here. Oh, wrong one I did.
The floor was quite slippery.
No, it's all your business.
Yeah, you can hear that, right?
That was-
Yeah, no, I can't even come up with anything different.
No, do the S still, yes. I want to hear the original. That's why. Play it again.
What?
Someone's having a stroke.
I don't know what happened there. Let me do it again.
It's like, oh my goodness.
Oh, I know what happened there. With nursery stories, I think it was playing the whole thing, maybe.
Scary one.
That's what it was. That's probably what it was.
Don't play this too much.
She boiled sweet tea.
With the accent.
I don't drink sweet tea.
The kettle boiled quickly.
Hey, that
You
was
boiled.
good.
You got boiled.
Love that. Way to go, Emily. we heard the same thing. Yeah, all shocked.
A man's painting a sign.
Oh, you almost.
So close.
I'm trying to make sense of it. So I was like, painting, she was fine.
Yeah, I heard it there. I heard painting a sign. Man was painting a sign. Let's play it again here. Yeah. I thought that one's kind of interesting.
I do that like all day.
I can do this all day.
I'm sure you could make an app for it and sell it as some kind of like game. I'm sure you could make money doing something like that.
Have you guys ever seen that one card game where you just like, yeah, where you just like read the sentence and then you have to read it really fast and it makes it like a saying or something? That's a really fun game.
Make a sine wave speech game, telling you. Okay.
I would play it.
Me too.
So yeah, that was the idea. Is that the idea was that I was supporting the presence of some kind of special speech mechanism, because you could change whether it was heard as speech versus non-speech depending on instructions. I don't know all the ins and outs of all these controversies behind them for all of these, so I'm afraid I don't have a lot more in the way of detail on some of these. The McGurk effect. You guys have heard of the McGurk effect, right? Or have you seen an example of it? Maybe in psychology classes they probably talk about it even more. So the McGurk effect is, again, another one of these phenomena that seems to support the idea of a speech-specific module. It occurs when you have incongruous cues being presented to auditory and visual modalities simultaneously. So say, for example, one ear receives ba. Not one ear, I'm sorry. The ears together receive ba. And then visually, what you're seeing on the screen, the person is mouthing the cues for ga. But what you hear is a hybrid of those. You hear da. So let me show you an example of that.
Oh, I've seen this. Someone posted this on Facebook.
It's a little on the cheesy side on this one, but it's still pretty decent. Internet's terrible in here. Just pause it until it plays. Okay, I think we're squared away here, so let me go ahead and play it.
Watch this experiment. It's called...
Oh, maybe it was not squared away. All right. Pause that. Okay, last try. Let's go ahead and see if this works now.
experiment. It's called the McGurk effect.
Ba, 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 ba.
What do you think he's saying? If you think he's saying da, 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 you are in the grand majority. But now, close your eyes and listen instead.
I thought he
of
said
watching.
ba. Yeah.
Ba, 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 ba.
The voice is saying ba, ba, ba. Now, let's replay it without the sound. Yes, it's true.
From the movements, because place of articulation is that's the one that you really can take from lip reading to the greatest extent. So my guess would take play. Actually, we saw that exact thing happen there as we moved place of articulation from bilabial over to labiodental, going from ba to fa. We were taking the place of articulation cue and from visually overriding what we were hearing auditorily.
Isn't that what a lot of people do when they have those like puppets? They just like substitute. I heard you substitute the B's for D's, so like you can't see it with the mouth as
You're
much.
probably right. I
You
don't
just,
know
like,
much
do it
about
lower.
that, but I think I have heard something about the ventriloquist
Yeah.
and McGurk effect. You're probably right. Some
Yeah.
tricks of the trade there.
I hate him, but he is good.
So here, ba and ga produce da, and apparently ga and ba produce some kind of hybrid, baga. Like a chicken, I guess. All right. Or, yeah, chicken. Why are you clucking? All right. So, moving on from the McGurk effect. Power of speech sounds, we've kind of already talked about that, I think, in Hearing Aids 1, but we'll briefly just run over that one more time. We know vowels have they're more intense, they have more energy than consonants, because vowels typically have most of their energy concentrated in the low frequencies, which means that the long-term average speech spectrum tends to be low frequency weighted. If we compare the least intense and the most intense phonemes in the English language, we have, I have kind of a little lisp, so I have a hard time doing that one. The theta symbol there for the voiceless fricative TH, that's the weakest sound in the English language. In contrast, I think I can do this one now. Aw, there we go, aw.
Aw, you got it.
There we go. The aw vowel is going to be the most intense, and the difference between them is quite intense, a ratio of 680 to 1. In terms of decibels, that's almost 30 decibels. Remember, the dynamic range of speech that we talk about is about 30 decibels, or maybe like 28 decibels, but we round it to 30. Again, it depends on how you calculate dynamic range, but the difference between those is about almost 30 decibels. So if we want to look at these in order, we can see that all the vowels are going to be essentially more intense than the consonants all around. I mean, semivowels, like the glides, for example, are going to be more intense than most consonants, but less intense than vowels. We see nasals are a bit more on the intense side here. The fricatives are usually the softest and the quietest. I guess the exception here is S seems to be quite a bit higher. But the fricatives are definitely on the softer side relative to some of the vowels. So this kind of supports the idea of using a dynamic range of 30 dB, which is really what hearing aid manufacturers they base certain modifications or programming of their hearing aids, and those who create hearing aid prescriptions, they base it on the idea of dynamic range being 30 dB. So here's that long-term average speech spectrum, which you've seen before. We've got two different plots on there that are remarkably similar to one another. We've got the Byrne data, which was the black circles, and then the Cox and Moore data, a little bit older, the white circles. They're fairly different in some ways. So for the long-term average speech spectrum, we can see that the greatest intensity for both of these is going to be right around 700, 800, 900 hertz or so, and then above that it slopes down. For every octave, we see a decrease in intensity. Overall speech is around 70 dB SPL. If we take one value, one number, an average. The Byrne data was compiled from both male and female adult talkers, but across 12 different languages. And we can see that it was also collected at a 45-degree horizontal azimuth. Whereas the Cox and Moore data, again, also male and female, but only for English, and then at 0 degrees azimuth. So even though there were some definite methodological differences between the two studies, they produced remarkably similar long-term average speech spectrums. So when we look at a spectrogram versus a long-term average speech spectrum, we can see the spectrogram varies over time, because we have 3 parameters we're looking at with a spectrogram, one of them being time. So we see the intensity or the frequency change over time. With the long-term average speech spectrum, we're just looking at intensity and frequency. We're not looking at time, which means we have to either take a snapshot in time or we have to average over time. In this case, we're averaging over time. It may be 10 seconds, it may be 60 seconds, but it's averaged over a long period of time, which you might consider, 60 seconds. So with the power of the speech spectrum in mind, we can look at other areas that affect speech intelligibility. When we use the term speech intelligibility, we're usually talking about the clarity or comprehension or recognition ability for speech. If you look in the SLP literature, sometimes they'll talk about speech intelligibility in terms of like speech quality. If you look at some studies in speech pathology, where they're looking at the speech of those with Parkinson's or the speech of those who have articulation disorders, you might see subjective ratings of speech, like on a 1 to 10 scale. But in audiology, oftentimes we're talking about speech intelligibility as an objective measure of quantifying what percent correct. It would be a good example. So, but there are a lot of names that we use for the same idea. You might call it speech recognition, you might call it word identification, you might call it speech discrimination, you might call it an articulation score. So lots of names for the same thing. We also modify them based on the content, word recognition, sentence recognition, let's see what else here, monosyllabic word recognition, yeah. So there's a lot of different names for the same thing. And we also have different response paradigms, open set versus closed set. What's the difference between open set and closed set? Probably from Dr. Downs, you might have learned that, or we talked about this before, maybe, I don't know.
Open is where, or a closed set is where there's a certain list that you can point
Yeah,
to.
yeah. What's an example of a closed set test we use in audiology? Yep, SRT certainly is. Can you think of any other ones? I don't think that even would fall into the category. Yeah.
Would it be the whipping book?
Yeah, the WIPI, exactly. That's definitely one. WIPI, SSI, DSI, those are a couple. Yeah, but most of our tests, I guess, are open set. But yeah, those are definitely good answers. So open set, it requires the subject to either repeat. Most of the time we have them do it verbally. We definitely could have them write it. We could also have them type it, a little bit more modern and contemporary, to have them type it in there. But all those are examples of ways to have an open set design. But the key thing is you're not giving them any indication of what the words may be, what the constraints might be. So that would be like NU6 testing, quicksand testing, and closed set testing, where we've got different alternatives or foils in addition to the correct response. SRT, SSI, variety of others. And when we're looking at how does audibility impact speech intelligibility, or really in particular, how does intensity level of speech, and how does signal-to-noise ratio of speech signal, how does that affect intelligibility, we can see that there's a clear trend. There's a monotonic relationship between speech level and percent correct up through around, around maybe 45, 50 dB SPL. At that point, we kind of start to plateau, or you may asymptote is another name for it, asymptote. Or if you say the function becomes asymptotic, then that's where it kind of flattens out, and you've reached kind of the highest percent correct that you're going to get. Usually for normal hearing listeners, I think that's where we get the idea of using for word recognition testing at 40 dB Ray SRT. Is from normal hearing listeners. They typically they will asymptote around 30 or 40 dB Ray SRT for probably for monosyllabic word recognition. And so this kind of plot we would call a psychometric function. Here's a different psychometric function, this time on the x-axis. Instead of speech intensity, we have signal-to-noise ratio. Overall, the trend is very similar. As SNR improves, speech intelligibility typically improves along with it. Not much to say beyond that. We've already kind of talked about these topics quite a bit. And so a lot of this is kind of a little bit of a rehash, or just a slightly different spin on some of the things we've talked about before. How does frequency impact the amount of information carried? Are certain frequencies more important than others? I know we've already talked about this in terms of band important functions in hearing aids. So we can, what is the relevance? Why does this matter? And if we understand how much each frequency contributes to speech intelligibility overall, then a couple things we can predict. We can use formulas to predict what speech intelligibility should be based on what percentage of speech is audible. So like the speech intelligibility index or its predecessor, the articulation index. Or we can also use it for communication, the field of communication. So what bandwidth is required to transmit enough information to make it intelligible? So what is the minimum bandwidth we can utilize to convey intelligible speech? So maybe like military applications, for example. And then Egan and Wiener looked at speech. And they filtered it, and using, I think, 1,500 hertz as the center frequency, maybe a little bit higher than that. They filtered it in a variety of ways, and they found a 3,000 hertz bandwidth allowed for about 85% intelligibility. And I think that's consistent with some earlier studies that found a 300 hertz bandwidth also was consistent with reasonable intelligibility, and that's why the phone lines typically transmit the range of around, I think it's 30 or no, I think it's 100. I can't remember the low end. It goes up to 3,000 hertz. The low end, I think, is 300 hertz. 300 hertz to 3,000 hertz for phone lines. So a few years later, French and Steinberg reported some data, again, on filtered speech as well. They looked at low-pass and high-pass filtering with around, I think it's around 1,800 hertz or so. 1,900 hertz is where it overlaps between the two functions. You can see with the filter cutoff for high-pass, as the filter cutoff increases, speech intelligibility decreases. As the low-pass filter cutoff decreases, speech intelligibility decreases. So what we're essentially saying is, say for example, on the extreme end, if we have a low-pass filter setting of 0.2 kilohertz, meaning you only have information 200 hertz and below, you're going to get 0% correct. In contrast, same idea, but on the opposite side of the spectrum, if we have a high-pass filter cutoff frequency around 6,000 hertz, and we only provide information above 6,000 hertz, again, you're going to get 0% intelligibility here. You can see it right here, 0% intelligibility there, and the opposite side of the spectrum, 0% intelligibility there. We can see that where high-pass and low-pass functions intersect around 1,900 hertz, that where we're getting about 68% correct here. Because they intersect, what do you think that means about the the relationship between signals higher in frequency and lower in frequency than 1,900 hertz? What is the relationship between the two for signals higher and lower than 1,900 hertz? How do they relate to one another in terms of importance? Exactly, yeah, they're equally important. So, so we can say that the 1,900 hertz and above, whatever their high is, I'm guessing 10,000 hertz, provides the same amount of speech information as 1,900 hertz and below. So why do you think why are we getting 68% correct there, not 50% correct? It's a little trickier one than the others. Any guesses? No fault of your own if you don't know, but any guesses at all?
The degree of the
What's interesting about speech? Let me put it to you this way. Why is it that we can still hear speech fairly well even if we have a certain hearing loss in a quiet environment? Even if we have a significant hearing loss in the highs, we can still do okay hearing speech. Not talking about vision at all, but why is that?
Because all the vowels are lower frequency.
You're on the right track in the sense that it's really about the speech signal. It's because the speech signal is very redundant. The speech signal. If you start to, here's an example. If you have normal hearing, and you filter out. Let's talk about the telephone again. We filter out the signal above 3,000 hertz and below 300 hertz. We can still make it out really pretty well. And the reason we can do that is because there's more than enough information in the signal being transmitted, so that if we have degradation of the signal, we still do okay. Imagine being in a fast food drive-through, right? The signal typically coming through is fairly poor, but you can usually get it well enough. So if speech was not redundant at all, we would expect this to be around 50%, but because it is, that's why we typically have 68%. So we don't get 68 plus 68 equals the total. It's just there's certain information that are shared by both that could be potentially conveyed by highs or lows. So another area that is very relevant to hearing aids, but this particular area is talking about those with normal hearing, would be peak clipping. So if we take a undistorted waveform and we intentionally clip it, and this would happen in the real world, say with a hearing aid, if you're overdriving the hearing aid, if you've exceeded the dynamic range of the hearing aid, if you've transitioned from the linear function of the hearing aid to the nonlinear portion, where output cannot increase any further with increases in input. So in that case, we have our sinusoidal wave turning into a square wave. We've got the peaks cut off, and it so happens that we've got additional frequencies that are introduced in the output that were not in the input, so we've got a distortion. But as objectionable as peak clipping may be in terms of sound quality, it doesn't have any significant negative effect on speech intelligibility, surprisingly. In contrast, if we preserve those peaks, but we center clip it, we get rid of the middle portion of it, then speech intelligibility drops quite abruptly to 0. So I guess the carryover here, I suppose, would be that peak clipping for our hearing aid users, even though we don't use it very much, we don't really have to worry about peak clipping having a huge negative effect on speech understanding as much as just sound quality. And then another way to degrade the speech signal would be to use temporal distortions. And one example of those temporal distortions would be interruptions. I don't think we use interrupted speech in any kind of APD testing, but I could always be wrong on that one. For interrupted speech, the general idea is that the signal is being, again, interrupted, so it's off and on, off and on, off and on. It's changing over time, so it's temporally distorting. The interruption rate is how many times each second the signal is being interrupted. It could be one time every 10 seconds, or it could be 10,000 times per second. So it's a pretty darn wide range. Now, the speech time fraction is the overall proportion that the overall proportion that the speech time is on. And so if you want to find the speech time fraction, you'd probably want to know the interruption rate, and you'd want to know the duration of the interruption, I suppose. So it should be the interruption rate and the duration of the interruption should allow you to calculate the speech time fraction. So some older data from Miller and Licklider from 1950. What they were looking at here is they were creating certain speech time fractions intentionally. So 75% means that the signal was present 75% of the time. I'm sorry, speech was on 75% of the time. 50% means speech was on 50% of the time. 25% speech was on 25% of the time. And y-axis here is percent correct. So what we can see here is that clearly we have higher percent correct as we move up in terms of speech time fraction. The more time the speech time fraction, the higher the speech time fraction, the greater the time that speech is on, and the more information you have, and the greater the intelligibility. So what we can see here is that as the interruption rate increases above, going from 1 to 10 interruptions, we improve performance or so, then we decline and improve again. So the reason that with, say, 1 interruption per second we do so poorly is because the duration of the interruption must be longer, meaning we're going to miss whole words. Okay, so we might have a duration that lasts a whole second, for example, and so that would cause you to miss entire words. And the reason we typically can do so well with these very, very long interruptions is because the interruptions are so frequent that the duration of the interruption is so short, meaning that we still have many, many, many glimpses of the signal that we're listening to. So these little interruptions are not having a huge effect on the information that's being conveyed because they're so short in duration. Okay, I'm going to pause for 1 second.